And I'm going to mute myself out.
Okay, so thank you. Well, I want to welcome everybody as you're joining the Sunshine ERC webinar this afternoon. Our topic is silicosis, old disease, new exposures, and regulation for prevention. Silicosis is the oldest known pneumoconiosis, yet new exposures like in countertop manufacturing and new outbreaks are continuing to occur. In 2017, OSHA enacted expanded silica standards, including medical surveillance requirements. Dr. Kathleen Fagan and Joan Spencer will discuss the new standards, describe recent clusters of severe silicosis, and review the health effects of silica exposure. I'm pleased to introduce our two presenters tonight. Dr. Kathleen Fagan is a physician, board certified in occupational medicine. She received her medical degree from Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine and completed an internship and residency in occupational medicine at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, including a master's in public health. She practiced clinical occupational medicine in Cleveland, Ohio for over 25 years, after which she joined the OSHA Safety and Health Administration Office in Washington, D.C. as a medical officer in 2009. She retired from OSHA in 2019 and is now doing part-time consulting work in occupational medicine. Joan Spencer is presently employed as the Compliance Assistant Specialist in the Tampa area office of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Ms. Spencer provides advice, education, and training to businesses, labor organizations, and other associations to promote voluntary compliance with OSHA's safety and health standards. Prior to her compliance assistant position, Ms. Spencer conducted both safety and health enforcement inspections for OSHA in manufacturing, service, construction, and maritime industries. Ms. Spencer holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Tampa and a Master of Public Health in Industrial Hygiene, Safety, and Management from the University of South Florida. The American Board of Industrial Hygiene certified Ms. Spencer in 1994. And with that, I'm pleased to turn the presentation over to Dr. Fagan.
Thank you very much. Let me pull up the slides. All righty. So first I want to thank the ERC for inviting Joan and I to talk about silicosis, and thank particularly Kelly and Kathy for their help. And it's a pleasure to kind of share the virtual stage with Joan Spencer. And I'm going to start, and what we're going to do is talk about an overview of silicosis, silica-related diseases, and new exposures and severe diseases. Joan will talk about the silica standards and enforcement, and I'll chime in a little at the end about medical surveillance. And then we should have a lot of time for questions and answers. But before we jump in, I think it's appropriate to remember that silica exposure caused probably the largest occupational health disaster in the US during the Great Depression. In Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, there were many workers. They flocked to West Virginia to get jobs tunneling through the Gauley Mountain that contained a very large amount of silica. Between 500 and 1,000 workers died of acute silicosis during that time. They were buried in mass graves. 76% of those workers were Black. Right now, we're seeing Black, Hispanic, immigrant, and vulnerable workers overrepresented in essential jobs like healthcare, meat packing, food service, housekeeping, postal service, and they're getting COVID, and some of them are dying. This quote from Martin Luther King is included in a recent American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine statement on systemic racism. It calls on all of us to confront and work against racism. Occupational health is part of public health, and basic to public health is health equity. So we all need to strive for that every day. And now let's talk about silicosis. So as was mentioned, it's really the oldest known pneumoconiosis. Hippocrates described difficulty breathing, mine workers having difficulty breathing. And then the father of occupational medicine, Bernardino Ramazzini, published a whole chapter on stonecutters in his book on diseases of occupations. And that was published in 1700. And he described what was silicosis in these stonecutters. So there's 3 clinical presentations of silicosis, and I'll be talking about each. So why 3? And that goes back to your basic toxicology concept of dose. So at lower doses of silica exposure over longer periods of time, you have chronic silicosis. But if the exposures are higher, then the disease you will see is accelerated silicosis, and at very high exposures, you see acute silicosis. The diagnosis is made by taking a good exposure history and looking at the chest imaging. So always get a B reading with your chest x-ray. And then a lot of people are starting to use HRCT, high resolution CT scans, because they seem to be more sensitive. And in the long run, they may replace digital radiographs for diagnosing and following pneumoconioses. Now, the pulmonary functions can be variable. They may be normal, they may show obstruction or restriction or a mixed pattern, and we'll talk about why that is. So let's first talk about chronic silicosis, because that's the most common. The latency between onset of exposure and onset of disease is at least 10 to 20 years or more. And it's usually slowly progressive. Frequently early on, there's no symptoms at all, and then it may progress to shortness of breath or cough. The physical exam may also be normal initially, but down the road, you may hear the dry crackles characteristic of interstitial fibrosis. Classic chest x-ray findings are small, rounded opacities, usually in the upper lung fields bilaterally, but sometimes can be throughout the lungs, and that x-ray on the right kind of shows that, but it's a little hard to see. And then the x-ray on the left shows what sometimes happens, which is that you can get fibrosis of the hilar nodes and actually calcifications. And then the classic eggshell calcifications, which those arrows show. And if you see that, although it's rare, that's pathognomonic for silicosis. Now the classic findings on pathology, as you see in the bottom left, are these whorls of collagen or hyalinized tissue, and they're surrounding particles of either silica or silicates that you can see on polarizing microscopy. But you don't need a biopsy to make the diagnosis. If you have an exposure history and classic x-ray findings, that can be sufficient to make the diagnosis. There's been a good amount of research on the mechanisms of silicosis, and it has basically 2 types. There's direct cytotoxicity, and then there's indirect inflammation caused when a silica particle is phagocytized and the inflammation and fibrosis occurs. And this next slide is a drawing of the mechanisms, the pathologic mechanism. And actually, I'm not going to go through it in detail because probably some of you can describe some of this better than I can. But what you see is the silica particle getting phagocytized, and then it kind of causes the phagosome to break down, and then that releases the pro-inflammatory molecules like cytokines, creates reactive oxygen species that then sets off that inflammatory cascade with inflammation and fibrosis. Now let's talk about accelerated silicosis. That's, as I said, with higher exposures. The latency is much shorter, 5 to 10 years in many cases. And the symptoms, though, are similar to chronic, but it occurs faster. And the symptoms can be more severe. You get shortness of breath, maybe a productive cough. And then frequently you'll get constitutional symptoms like weight loss, fever, fatigue. And these may be due to underlying associated diseases like infections. And I'll talk about some of the associated diseases. The chest X-ray shows, will show those small rounded opacities, but they will coalesce, and you may get bigger rounded opacities, or as in the case of this chest X-ray, progressive massive fibrosis in the upper lung fields. Studies, and then the bottom CT scan shows nodules of varying sizes. And it turns out that HRCT is more sensitive than a chest radiograph for identifying the silica nodules. Also, studies are showing that it's probably better correlated with pulmonary function testing. And there's more consistency in the readings among radiologists. So that, as I said before, that may, in the long run, be what we do instead of chest X-rays. Now, accelerated silicosis also is more likely to be, to have complications, including progressive massive fibrosis, infections, kidney disease, or autoimmune diseases. And then acute silicosis. Now, this is a very different disease than chronic or even accelerated silicosis. It's due to very, very high exposures with poor controls in the workplace. Its latency can be weeks to months, up to about 2 years, and it's almost always fatal. The symptoms are very rapid with shortness of breath, productive cough, hemoptysis, pleuritic chest pain. There's a high risk of infection. And then the chest X-ray shows consolidation, and as shown on this X-ray, kind of an angel wing pattern in the hilar regions. On CT scan, it's a typical kind of ground glass appearance. And the pathology then is different than chronic and accelerated. And as it shows here in the pathology slides, there is alveolar proteinosis in the alveolar spaces, proteinaceous material. Now, these pathology slides are from a 2019 report from Australia of acute silicosis in 2 countertop workers. Both needed lung transplants to survive. And I'll be talking more about countertop workers in a minute. So I mentioned that silicosis, that silica exposure has associated diseases. And these are the associated diseases. First, as I'm sure many of you know, lung cancer is associated with silica exposure. The International Agency for Research on Cancer and also EPA have deemed silica a group 1 human carcinogen. And you don't need to have silicosis to have lung cancer. If you're exposed then you are at risk, and there seems to be some dose-response relationship. There's also a greater than additive effect if you smoke cigarettes, so very similar to asbestos. So it's really important to counsel workers on smoking cessation. So another reason to counsel them on smoking cessation is COPD. There's an increased risk of COPD in silica-exposed workers. And like lung cancer, you don't need silicosis to have COPD. And also, there is a dose response or exposure response relationship. And another thing to point out is that although smoking will obviously increase the risk of COPD, the studies show that even when controlling for smoking, the risk of COPD goes up if you're exposed to silica. And finally, that's the reason that the pulmonary function testing can be variable. It can be restrictive, it can be obstructive, or it can show a mixed pattern. There are many types of kidney disease that are also associated with silica exposure. Both acute and chronic kidney disease, glomerulonephritis, and end-stage renal disease have been associated with silica exposure. There are case reports primarily of autoimmune glomerulonephritis in silica workers. And then there are some mortality studies that have shown have shown death from acute kidney injury, chronic kidney disease, and end-stage renal disease in silica-exposed workers with a positive exposure response trend. The pathogenesis is not well worked out for this, and there certainly may be an autoimmune component. And also autoimmune diseases like systemic lupus erythematosus, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, and various vasculitides like Wegener's granulomatosis have all been described with silica exposure. And similar to other pneumoconioses, silica workers have an increased incidence of just positive ANAs and positive rheumatoid factors. And then there's a significant increased risk of activation of latent TB. Also an increased risk of other infections, particularly mycobacterial and fungal infections. And all of these are seem to be more common in acute and accelerated silicosis. So what's the treatment for silicosis? The only effective treatment is lung transplantation for severe silicosis. So I'm going to go through what's been looked at for treatment of silicosis. Now remember, reactive oxygen species play a part. They play a part both in direct cellular toxicity and in the indirect creation of inflammation and fibrosis. So way back in the 1930s, that silica was noted to generate free radicals that on the surface of cells causing cell death. And then animal studies were performed where they coated silica particles with aluminum citrate or this polyvinyl pyridine N oxide and found that, well, then there were no free radicals on the lung cells. So some researchers got the idea of having workers inhale aluminum dust, and in the 1950s in England they had a number of studies, and bottom line is they were not effective. They didn't prevent silicosis or improve outcomes. So that didn't work. Now, corticosteroids have been used for severe silicosis and for accelerated and acute silicosis in a similar way that they're used with other interstitial lung diseases. And there is some improvement early on in symptoms for workers who are severely ill, but the effect is not sustained, and over the long run, they don't seem to cause improvement in outcome. And there's also concern, obviously, with an increased risk of infection in silicotics that are taking corticosteroids. Now, another area that's been looked at is Chinese herbal medicine. And these are studies, there are Chinese herbal medicines with antioxidant properties, and there's a lot of research out of China. China has a lot of silicosis. So there's been studies in animals and even human studies that show some improvement in cases of silicosis, but all of these studies that have been looked at have poor design, small numbers, not very long follow-ups. So the jury is out on whether Chinese herbal medicine helps. Then whole lung lavage. So the idea there was that the dust would get cleared out of the lung and the inflammatory cells would get cleared out. So people were doing bronchoalveolar lavage. And there seemed to be some initial improvement, again, with severe disease and severe symptoms, but no evidence of any long-term benefit. So then I went on the web and I'm looking for other types of treatment. And there are in vitro and in vivo animal studies targeting steps in the inflammatory cascade, like genetic tweaks or drugs that block pathways. So I ran across imipramine, which is a tricyclic antidepressant, but it has anti-inflammatory properties. So there were studies of mice exposed to silica, and imipramine blocked that silica-induced lysis of the phagosomes, preventing cell death and preventing the release of the pro-inflammatory mediators. But there's been no human studies. And then, much to my surprise, even hydroxychloroquine has been studied in silica-exposed mice and in vitro because it seems to stabilize lysosomal membranes, so decrease their permeability when they're exposed to silica. And again, no human studies yet. So bottom line on that is there's really no treatment other than lung transplantation for severe silicosis, and management is symptomatic. Bronchodilators, oxygen, maybe pulmonary rehabilitation. Vocational rehabilitation and retraining really should be considered for workers with silicosis who can't work with silica anymore. And I think healthcare providers have a responsibility to help workers through the various systems like vocational rehab and workers' comp. So now getting to new exposure settings and severe disease. First, there have been several new exposure settings in the last decade, and one of them that you've heard about, I'm sure, is hydraulic fracturing. In 2011, NIOSH did studies showing increased exposures to fracking workers above the permissible exposure limit. Now, I haven't seen, or I'm not aware of cases of silicosis in this worker population yet, so I'm not going to talk any more about fracking workers. But I am going to talk about two other worker groups. One are coal miners, and the other are countertop workers. So coal miners, NIOSH, runs the Black Lung program, and in 2005, they, and it's shown here, they published an article. They had looked at progressive black lung disease, co-workers pneumoconiosis, over a 5-year period from 1996 to 2001. And they found that of those cases where they saw progression, 35% of those cases, or 277 workers, had what they felt was rapid progression, where they had jumped at least 1 or 2 levels in perfusion. And 41 of those workers had progressive massive fibrosis, and this is much different than they had seen previously. Since then, they've been following this group. They found that, number one, this group of more rapidly progressive disease was in younger workers, working in smaller mines and generally working at the face, so underground workers. And when they further investigated, they found both the clinical picture and then the pathology picture on biopsies or autopsies were consistent with severe silicosis. They found that they were geographically clustered in the east, Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia. And they think it's because there's they're running into thinner coal seams. And when they're cutting at the face, they're cutting below and above and below the seams where there's a high silica content. And they've also seen an increase in the surface miners, which they think is due to plumes of dust from the drilling. The second group is the countertop workers that I mentioned. So these are artificial stone workers, which is artificial stone's also called engineered stone. And that's made by combining quartz with polymer resin and pigments, then heat cured and fashioned into slabs that are cut, shaped, and polished, usually into countertops. Engineered stone has 90% or more silica content. And compare that with granite, which has about 45% silica, or marble, which only has about 10% silica. So in 2012, the Lung Transplant Center in Israel, and this is the only lung transplant center in Israel, reported on a cluster of 25 case countertop workers who presented to them with severe silicosis needing a lung transplant. They all came from the same company. They all did the same work, cutting and grinding countertops without appropriate controls. They weren't wet cutting. They didn't have appropriate ventilation, and many didn't have appropriate or any respiratory protection. Now, in 2015, these cases have been reported around the world now. The first case in the US was in 2015, and then just last year, 2019, 18 cases were reported over 6 states, and 2 of those cases were fatalities. They were young workers, all but 1 less than 60 years old. They had a somewhat shortened latency. 2/3 of the cases were less than 20 years, and 4 of the 18 had only worked less than 10 years. And interestingly, they reported associated diseases with some of these workers. Rheumatoid arthritis in 4 cases, scleroderma in 1 case, and latent TB in 2 cases. So to summarize, we have the oldest known pneumoconiosis. We have no effective treatment, clusters of severe disease, workers dying. This is a failure of prevention. And that's why the silica standard is so important. The silica standards, and that's why I'm now going to turn this over to Joan to tell us about the silica standards.
Thank you, Kathy. I hope everyone can hear me. So we really did not have a silica standard until pretty recently. Our silica standard came out on March 25th of 2016. Prior to that, we had a PEL, a calculated PEL in our table Z's that that employers had to adhere to. But there was no standard to direct employers of how to control silica. Next. So when the standard came out in 2016, there was two standards. One was for general industry and maritime industries, and the other was for construction. And the reason why they split the two standards were to make one standard a little bit easier for construction industry and to have some measures in place that they can go right to. And then we had the general industry and maritime standard follow traditional OSHA standards. So both of these standards are similar to other OSHA health standards, and most employers have already put in place or implement their ASTM consensus standards. Next slide, please. So when I say they follow typical OSHA health standards, it's this outline right here for the general industry, where you have the scope, the definition, the permissible exposure limits, the exposure assessment, regulated areas, methods of compliance, respiratory protection, housekeeping, medical surveillance, hazard communication, and record keeping. Now you'll notice regulated areas is highlighted as red because that's a difference for the general industry and maritime standard that's not included in the construction standard. And both of these standards have two appendices: the method of sampling analysis and then medical surveillance guideline. Next slide, please. So the construction standard, again, scope, definition, respiratory protection, housekeeping, those are similar. But when it comes to the exposure assessment in construction, they have a list method for different types of tasks where there is specific exposure control methods, or they can use the traditional assessment where you're going to go out and sample and determine the employee's exposure. Again, also in red here, you'll see the written exposure control plan. Both standards require the written exposure control plan. Differences in construction, you have to have a competent person developing, implementing that exposure control plan. Next slide. So the silica standards, I gotta get rid of something on my screen so I can see it. So like I said, the silica standards, you have the assessments. These are general outlines of all health standards. So you have the assessment. So this standard applies to only those jobs, those tasks where the employee is going to be exposed at or above the action level under all foreseeable conditions. So if they're going to be below that under all foreseeable conditions, then the standard doesn't even apply to them. And when we talk about foreseeable conditions, we're talking about emergencies that may occur. So if levels are being are below the action level, and the only reason why they're below the action level is due to some type of engineering control, well, it's foreseeable to see that those engineering controls could stop working, that they break down. So that would not be included in this exception. That is a foreseeable condition, so the standard would apply to them. The standards want to ensure that employees are not exposed above the permissible exposure limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meters of air, averaged over an 8-hour day. So if they have extended work hours, then the employer would have to do a new calculation to determine what those PELs for those workers are. And of course, they want to limit other workers or the public to where those areas where the PEL would be not met. So you don't want just any employer or the public walking through areas where their exposure is going to be above the PEL of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air. Next slide, please. So the silica standards use the hierarchy of controls that OSHA implements in all health standards. Number one, to control the dust, you need to make sure that you have some type of engineering controls in. If the engineering controls do not limit that exposure below the PEL, then you're going to put in some type of work practice control or administrative controls. And then once you have the engineering controls in place, you have the administrative controls in place, you have the work practice controls in place, and you're still not meeting the levels below the PEL, then you would need to provide respirators to your workers when those controls don't limit that exposure. The housekeeping sections of these standards is basically, what is your housekeeping methods? What is schedule? How are you cleaning? How are you going to limit dust exposure in these housekeepings? Are you going to provide wetting agents? Are you only going to have wet sweeping? Are you going to have vacuums? What are those methods? And then in your written exposure control plan, in addition to listing housekeeping and your engineering controls, you need to identify those tasks where employees are going to be exposed to silica and where their overexposures are going to be. Next slide, please. And then the silica standard, not all of our health standards have medical surveillance, but the silica standards do. And of course, Kathy's going to talk about that in details after I speak. But these exams include chest x-rays, lung function tests, the medical surveillance or the medical exams need to be provided to the workers every 3 years, and these workers would be the ones that are exposed at or above the action level. But in construction, we don't base that requirement on the action level. We base it on their respiratory usage. So if they are using respirators for 30 or more days per year, they would be required to be under medical surveillance. Whereas for general industry and maritime, it's whether or not they are exposed at or above the action level for 30 days or more. Then of course you need to train your workers. And you have to have specific training on silica. So it just can't be like something mentioned in your hazard communication program. There are certain requirements in this training program that you have to meet. And of course, you're going to keep all your medical records, your exposure records, your objective data for exposure assessment according to OSHA's record keeping standard. And that is, you're going to keep those records for the time of employment plus 30 years. Next slide. So construction, I said that there's this section that has specific controls for silica, and if they meet those requirements of those controls, then OSHA would consider the employer to be in compliance with the PEL, and they would not need to do an exposure assessment, meaning sampling or using objective data or performance method to say that they are below the PEL. These tasks, there's 18 of them, are in Table 1 of the construction standard. They must implement those controls fully and properly to be in compliance with the standard. Next slide. So here's an example of one of them. One entry out of the 18. And this is for the task of someone using a handheld power saw, any blade diameter, So if the saw is used and is equipped with an integrated delivery system for water, it's going to feed that blade constantly, and the employer or the employees make sure that that tool is operated and maintained in accordance to the manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust, then if they're using that tool, doing that task outdoors for 4 hours or less, then they would not have to wear any type of respiratory protection. However, if they're using that piece of equipment for more than 4 hours, they would have to use a respirator that has an assigned protection factor of at least 10. And then no matter what, if it's used indoors or in an enclosed area, even with those things in place, the equipment having the integrated water delivery system, and they're operating the tool, maintaining the tool correctly, it doesn't matter what their shift is, they would have to wear a respirator with an APF of 10 or more. So in this example, I like to use this example because it says integrated water delivery system. That means this saw has a place where a hose can connect, water is turned on, and the water is continuously fed. This does not mean someone is sitting there with a pump bottle, pumping it and spraying at the same time. That would not be included in this table, and that employer would absolutely have to do an assessment. So this standard's been out for 4 years, and since then, a lot of the construction industry has said, well, why isn't this job or this task included in Table 1? This is a task that's done quite commonly. Situation doesn't really change much from one site to the other. Why can't we include this in Table 1? So they open the rulemaking on the standard again for construction to potentially see if more tasks can be included in Table 1. And there are some jobs where, you know, I was kind of surprised they weren't included on there. So this standard is under rulemaking. So keep an ear out to see if the standard does change in the next couple of years, 3 years. It takes a while for standards to get updated and change. Next slide, please. So when we talk about a respirator with a assigned protection factor, this was dictated what they are. And I don't, even though this is from the OSHA document on assigned protection factors, they have a half mask dust mask. We are not talking about a dust mask. We are talking about a filtering face piece respirator. That means it's going to have 2 straps. It's going to have a NIOSH TC number. It's going to be approved by NIOSH. We're not talking about the little molded cup respirators that have a single strap that you can buy at Home Depot. That is a dust mask. Those are good for big chunks that you're not going to inhale, like a blade of grass or a big chunk of dirt or something like that. It is not for small particles. And when we're talking about crystalline, respirable crystalline silica, we are talking about something that's 100 times smaller than a sand pebble that you'll find on the beach, you know, sand grain on the beach. So the half mask filtering face piece respirators do have an assigned protection factor of 10, just as the elastomeric half mask respirators have an assigned protection factor of 10. If you get into the PAPRs, loose fitting, so they'll have like a face shield with a cowl on it or a hood, then they have a assigned protection factor of 25. So theoretically, if everything's perfect, everything's being worn correctly, that means that the employees could be exposed to silica 25 times greater than the PEL, and they should be protected. A full face respirator gives them a sign protection factor of 50. And then we get into the air supplied respirators, which is the next slide. And here we have the full face supplied air respirator, or the SAR, that has an escape bottle. So this has an assigned protection factor of 1,000, meaning that someone could be exposed to silica levels theoretically 1,000 times higher than the PEL. And when I say theoretically, it's because people don't wear the respirators correctly. They have failures. So, but if everything's perfect, it will protect up to 1,000 times higher than the PEL. And then if we're in escape mode only of this respirator, then the sign protection factor is 10, because air is going to be supplied at that point. And then the full face abrasive blasting continuous flow also has a sign protection factor of 1,000. Now, one thing I want to say right here, because it reminded me of this is a silica standard. There are specific standards for abrasive blasting, and those standards are still in place. So if you're doing abrasive blasting, not only do you have to look at the silica standard, you have to look at the ventilation standards for abrasive blasting. You have to look at the personal protective equipment standard for abrasive blasting. So make sure that if you're doing that type of work, you have those. And then we have the SCBA, the self-contained breathing apparatus, that has a sign protection factor of 10,000, I believe. It's cut off, so I can't really see. That's my memory. So it could be wrong on that one. Next slide. So these are the 18 tasks that are included in table 1 right now. So handheld grinders for mortar removal or tuck pointing, handheld grinders for other mortar removals, walking behind milling machines and floor grinders, rig mounted core saws or drills, walk behind saws. These are the only things we have in place. So very common things that you may do at home, like fixing a hole in your wall and putting in some plaster or material to even out that wall and sanding it down. That's not in table 1. Seems to be, that's a pretty common one. It should have been in here. And that's what they're looking at. They're looking at those recommendations. They're looking for information. Should some other jobs be in there? Next slide, please. So the written exposure control plan, I've kind of gone over that, but the plan has got to be, number 1, written. It's got to identify those tasks where exposure to respirable crystalline will occur, what engineering, what work practice administrative controls are you using, and for which task, the housekeeping measures to limit those exposure measures, the procedures to restrict the public and other workers in work areas to minimize their exposure. So in construction, you're gonna have to spell that out in the written exposure control plan. In general industry, there's that regulated area. So through that regulated area, meeting those conditions is this section of the exposure control plan. Next slide. Like I said, for construction, you need to have a designated competent person. When we talk about a competent person, this means this is someone who can recognize the hazard and they can stop the hazard. So this person's gonna be doing regular and frequent inspections. They're gonna look at the materials, they're gonna look at the equipment, make sure the equipment is in proper working order and the workers are actually using this. How often is frequent and regular? We don't say. It depends on the task. If you have someone that's sanding constantly, then it's going to be pretty often, pretty frequent. But if it's something that is occasional, that's done for 10 minutes, for 3 times a day, then it might be that type of frequency that we're looking at. Your exposure control plan needs to be reviewed annually, and if needed, to be updated. So with any type of exposure control plan, whether it's silica, lead, bloodborne pathogens, when you review it, you need to mark on that plan when it was reviewed, because it is annual. And if maybe somebody reviewed it, they didn't mark down when it was reviewed on that cover sheet of that program or in the computer, then we don't know. And then the exposure control plan, along with the standard, needs to be readily available for your employees. In fact, the standard says you need to supply a copy of the standard to your employees. And that could be through training or posting the standard or having it available for them. Next slide. So in addition to the standard, we have what we call national emphasis programs, regional emphasis programs, and local emphasis programs. Kathy mentioned the countertop manufacturers. Our Fort Lauderdale office, I would say maybe 10 years ago, had a local emphasis program just for countertops. And that was under what we had at that time was the silica special emphasis programs. So OSHA has been looking at silica since OSHA's inception. We've had special emphasis programs for years. We had initiatives. We had the national emphasis program for silica that came out in 2008. It stopped in 2019, and it was replaced with this national emphasis program on February 4th of 2020. So emphasis programs are a way for OSHA to reserve their resources, because we are a small entity, and to pinpoint those industries where they may be having issues. At one time, we use record keeping results, looking at those companies that were having those, not looking at the companies, but looking at those industries where they were having the high exposures to target different industries. And this is basically what they've done here. They've updated the list based on some information that OSHA has received of what industries we're targeting. I want to mention here, that is a directive. I want to mention here also, we have a new OSHA instruction directive on silica. It came out on June 25th of 2020. And this is the inspection procedures for inspecting crystalline silica. So basically these directives tell OSHA compliance officers of how they're going to conduct these inspections. The NEP says this is how we're going to determine who we're going to inspect, whereas the instructions for the instructions for the inspection itself is located in the CPL 02-02-80. Like I said, it's really for the compliance officers. It's a guidance of how they're supposed to conduct these inspections. I highly recommend to anyone that's dealing with compliance in their companies to read these directives. And we have directives on just about everything, whether it's crystalline silica, lead, cranes, fall protection. There are directives out there. So I just wanted to mention we do have this directive that came out a couple of months ago. Next slide, please. So in this directive, it's stating that we are looking at only certain NAS codes that we will pick out and do a random choosing of companies that are within these industries due to the Appropriations Acts, Under Congress, we do not inspect companies under these programs that have 10 or less employees. So on the next slide, it shows what these appendixes, what we're covering. So in Appendix A, and there's also an Appendix B, that if we run out of companies on Appendix A, we can go to Appendix B. But this one is the industries that are covered in general industry and maritime. So you can see here that iron foundries, steel foundries are there. We have jewelry and silver manufacturing, dental equipment and supply manufacturing. Let's see what else. I'm sure it's in there. Cut stone and stone product manufacturing. So that would be where your countertops would be put in place. So they are an industry that we're targeting. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the construction industries that we're targeting. Looks like it's almost all of construction, but they're identifying as residential, non-residential, utilities, heavy engineering type industries where you have highway, street, and bridge construction, foundation and structure and building exteriors where you have the masons. So these are the specialty trades that we're also looking at. Next slide. So we'll have a opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy because she's going to talk about medical surveillance in great detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. So Joan already mentioned that there's a difference between general industry, maritime, and construction on who's covered. And that's what OSHA means by who's covered is which workers should an employer be offering medical surveillance to. In general industry and maritime, it's anyone exposed at or above the action level for 30 or more days per year. In construction, because not all construction is going to be doing air level testing if they're following Table A, it would be anyone required to wear a respirator for 30 or more days per year. Otherwise, there is no other difference between the two standards in terms of medical surveillance, and we'll quickly go through what the medical surveillance is. As Joan already mentioned, you get an initial exam, and then the frequency is every 3 years. It should include the medical and work history, physical exam, respiratory system, chest x-ray, pulmonary function, TB testing only on the initial exam. But here's my favorite part of all the OSHA medical surveillance standards. Any other tests deemed appropriate by the PLCP. What's a PLCP? That's OSHA speak for physician or other licensed healthcare provider. So a PLCP can order other tests. They can also suggest that, recommend that the worker get medical surveillance more frequently than every 3 years. I want to spend just a little time on chest x-rays and pulmonary function. As with other OSHA standards like asbestos, the chest x-ray must be read by a NIOSH certified B reader. It must be interpreted according to the ILO classification for pneumoconiosis. But here's the difference in silica standards and previous standards. If the B reading classifies small opacities in a perfusion of 1/0 or greater, then the PLCP must make the recommendation that the worker be referred to a board-certified pulmonary or occupational medicine specialist. In terms of pulmonary function tests, similar to previous other standards like asbestos, there must be spirometry that includes the forced vital capacity, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, and the ratio. And then here is where the standard differs from previous. These pulmonary function tests must be administered by a spirometry technician with a current certificate from a NIOSH-approved spirometry course. And at OSHA, we've had people ask, well, you know, I'm a doctor, I shouldn't need to take the course, right? I can still do the spirometry. And the answer is no. You have to be trained and have a current certificate from a NIOSH approved course. And I recommend this document that OSHA has produced, and you can find it at the end. And one other thing that I want to mention about this is I think this is probably one of the most effective parts of this regulation. I know of one national organization that has occupational health clinics around the country who said they will make sure they have at least one trained spirometry tech in each of their clinics. And they have done that. So that I think that this has improved spirometry testing in occupational health clinics around the country. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this slide, but we maybe want to talk about it at the question and answer, medical surveillance in the time of COVID, some references. This I want to spend a little time on. The PLIC-P, in previous standards, the PLIC-P provided a written medical opinion to the employer. Now the regulation for silica requires that the PLIC-P have two written documents. One is the written medical report to the employee, and that would include the results of their exam and tests, recommendations on respirator use, on whether they're recommending any restriction on silica exposure, whether they're recommending a referral to a specialist or any other recommendations. And this is not in lieu of talking to the worker, but in addition to talking to the worker. So the PLIC-P must both talk to the worker and give them the results and give them a written medical report. Now, the written medical opinion to the employer must include the date of exam, date of enacted exam, a statement that the exam meets the requirements of the standard, a statement that the worker has been informed of the results, and then any recommended limitation on use of a respirator. But here's the big difference between this and previous standards. The PLIC-P can only tell the employer if they are recommending to the worker that silica exposure should be limited or that they should be referred to a specialist if the employee signs a written authorization. So this is an increased level of confidentiality. It puts the decision in the hands of the worker. And why is that? It's because during the public hearings before silica standards were promulgated, OSHA heard from workers, from unions, from physicians, from others that if employers get this information, some workers may refuse to do the exams, and that is their right. They can refuse to have a medical surveillance exam. So they wouldn't get that information. And OSHA made the decision that they would rather have the worker get their medical exam, get their results, and make their own decisions about their health. So that's why this was created. There's a lot of issues we could talk about related to this that we might want to talk about in the discussion section. I think it puts more responsibility and ethical issues come up with the PLIC-Ps. So we could talk about that. And then I'm just going to end by noting that OSHA in Appendix B, which was mentioned previously, has these sample forms that are templates that you can use for those three things: the written medical report, the written medical opinion, and the worker authorization. Here's our references. Here's OSHA links. And here's how to get a hold of us if you have any more questions. And I'm going to end it there so that we have time for questions and answers and discussion. Thank you.
Hi, Joan and Dr. Fagan, thank you so much for your presentation. I do see one question in the chat. It's for both of you. It says RCS is considered a known human carcinogen. OSHA typically does not allow worker rotation to limit exposure to a known human carcinogen. Please explain how the OSHA standards for silica differ in this respect.
Joan, I'm not quite sure I understand about the rotation question. Do you?
I'm sorry, what?
I didn't understand the rotation part of the question.
Oh, okay, I understand it.
Oh, good.
Normally, you're correct. If it is a cancer agent, OSHA does not allow employee rotation. They go through this pretty extensively in the preamble, and I'm sorry, I'm getting old, and I don't quite remember what the reasoning was, other than I think it had to deal a little bit with the construction standard that they were going to allow employee rotation. And the reason was of those time limits in table 1 that would keep, if a job was over 8 hours, that they could cycle more than one employee through that task. I'm sorry, I just don't remember at this time. It was 4 or 5 years ago that I read the preamble, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but in the proposed standard, they were not going to allow employee rotation as a method of control, but when the standard finally came out, they did allow it. And it is unusual that they would allow it. I would not recommend it if I was an employer.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. So it was, can an employee refuse the medical exam? If so, how would the employer document that?
Well, yeah, as I said, the employee could refuse to take any of the medical surveillance exams. If the standards are geared to the employer must offer medical surveillance exams, but the employee could refuse. Now, OSHA doesn't say anything about what happens if the employee refuses. You know, so it could still be the employer decides, well, you're not, you know, I'm not going to hire you, or I'm not going to put you, you know, you can't work for me if you can't do the exam. OSHA doesn't really say anything about that. And I don't know if there's a specific way they document it, Joan, but I would guess they just document it. Maybe have the worker sign a declination.
I wouldn't do a verbal. I would absolutely have a declination statement that the employee signs. And like you said, OSHA does not have what you're supposed to do if they do decline any type of medical surveillance. So most people include that in their hiring process. It's something that the employee has to agree with before they're hired. Just like wearing a respirator. A lot of times, oh, I'm not shaving my beard. I've had my beard for 25 years. I'm not shaving it. Well, as a new hire, you should have in there, to have this job, you need to be clean shaven. And I guess at that point, the employer, if they do have like N95 respirators on an employee with a beard, well, they're not adhering to those sections of the standard, and they would be cited.
Great. Okay, so those are the questions that I see in the chat. Oh, here's another one. Do you think HRCT be used primarily for diagnosis rather than surveillance due to high exposure to radiation?
So this is not a silica question, I guess.
And then if anybody would like to ask questions themselves over, since we're in a meeting format, you can also just raise your hand and we can call on you. But yes, that was the question.
Oh, I know what the question is. It has to do with how much radiation you're getting, and I think there's, you know, low dose CTs now that aren't so bad, and they're recommended for following to a certain extent, or at least making a diagnosis for heavy smokers. So, you know, there's been no recommendations now around low-dose CTs and using them instead of chest x-rays, but it's certainly something they're going to be thinking about because of how much better it is in making a diagnosis. And right, and you may not follow someone along unless you think they have something else. You may not follow them along with HRCTs unless you think there's something else going on.
Okay, I have another question. Could OSHA issue a violation of the medical surveillance requirement if the employee refuses but still performs a job that requires it?
Whoa, that's an interesting one. What do you think, Joan?
Oh, I think they could cite it. I think they could cite it. I would have to get into that directive 02-02-080.
Okay.
See specifically what it says, but I believe they can be cited because
Well,
it's
if the worker declined but was otherwise protected, you know.
well, that's the burden of proof on us at all times.
Mm-hmm.
If
Okay.
if they're not exposed to the silica, then how are we going to cite that? Or they're not wearing that respirator for 30 days, then how would we cite that?
Sure, but if they were, so yeah, if they were wearing the respirator correctly, they had the effective control, they were following table 1, but the worker chose not to do medical surveillance.
I think the employer can be cited for that.
Huh.
Okay. And the thing is that they would just have to assign that worker to another position. I'll tell you what.
Oh, I see.
Personal computer's right here. I'm going to go grab it. And questions, I might be able to get that answer for you.
So that brings up the issue of medical surveillance in the time of COVID. And there are some links to some information from the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. ACOM did send a letter early on to OSHA about spirometry. ACOM made the recommendation to its membership to suspend spirometry early on in the coronavirus pandemic. And OSHA then did come out with basically saying, I don't know if I'll say this correctly, but they basically said, if there are certain parts of a medical surveillance exam that would put workers or staff at risk, then you could choose to suspend it until they're not at risk anymore. So that might be spirometry. And I know that a lot of clinics did suspend spirometry. So workers may not be getting the full medical surveillance exam. I also know that some workers, just from talking to people doing silica medical surveillance, some workers choose not to do some parts of the exam. So they do some of the exam, but not other parts of the exam. Of course, then the PLCP has to make a decision about whether they can actually say a worker has, is okay to work, right? Fit for duty and all of that. So, so there's a lot of twists and turns in this. ACOM also has made some recommendations about if you do start up spirometry again, there's certain things you should be putting into place. One for sure is with any kind of medical surveillance exam, can you put off the spirometry during COVID? But if you are going to do the spirometry, the staff should be adequately protected. Everything should be cleaned in between, each spirometry. So interesting times. Would you find anything, Joan?
No, I tried my phone first. That was a bus.
We might have to get back to you on that one. Any other questions?
Nope. So those are all the questions that are in the chat. And we can open it up to see if anyone else would like to ask a question or start a discussion at this time through the meeting. Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap. Okay, I guess that's it. So I have the contact information of the person who asked the previous question. So if you find anything that you would like to send over, I can forward that over.
That would be great. Also, the one that asked the question, because I can't remember, I'm too old, why we're allowing the rotation under the standard. If you could grab their information so we can get that answer over to them.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fagan and Joan Spencer. We really appreciate your presentation tonight. Very informative.
Okay.
Yes, thank you both. We appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you from Tom Bernard.
Hey.